If you have your Bibles this morning, we will be in 1 Kings chapter 17, and we will pretty much be reading the entire chapter before the morning is over. And we'll look at one passage real quick in chapter 16. So if you want to go ahead and be turning 1 Kings chapter 16, and then we'll be into 17. As you're doing that, every week we kind of have to catch up to where we are in the story as we move through the Old Testament as quickly as we are. If you kind of think through some of this, the timing of where we have been and how we got where we are, King David begins his reign at 1000 BC, so 1,000 years before Christ comes. King David begins his reign. That kingdom, then, last week we were with Solomon, but that reign of David with one united kingdom ends in 931. So it just lasts 69 years before the kingdom is divided into two pieces. Usually we refer to them as a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is called Judah, and that is where David's lineage stays. The capital is Jerusalem, and so we have Rehoboam and Abijah and Asa and Jehoshaphat. If you remember, I'm sure all of you do, last year at this time, we were in the southern kingdom. We were looking at those kings and talking about those kings. This year, we have moved into the northern kingdom, which was called Israel. We have moved into the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom goes through kings like crazy. They have more kings, and the kings do not last very long. The kings are not very good. But we have names here like Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Eliah, and then the seventh and eighth king is Omri and Ahab, which is where we're going to be today. So I skipped some kings in there, but there's a whole bunch of them. Today we're going to be talking about Ahab, and so I wanted to just kind of set this up. Southern kingdom, Judah, the capital is Jerusalem. Northern kingdom, Israel. Omri makes Smyrna the capital, Smyrna, like I'm from Tennessee. Samaria the capital, and so it's been one of those weekends. So Omri makes Samaria the capital, and so that's where we pick it up, and that's why I want you to see this in chapter 16. So 1 Kings chapter 16. This is the setting up of Ahab's reign. It says Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel in the 38th year of Judah's king Asa. Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria, also called Samaria, 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Not just did more, but he did it, or not just did evil, but did more than all who were before him. Then, as if following the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, were not enough, he married Jezebel. Most of y'all are familiar with the name Jezebel. Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbal, king of the Sidonians, and then proceeded to serve Baal and bow in worship to him. I have only one verse. He set up an altar, I forgot I went this far. Set up an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal that he had built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole. Ahab did more to anger the Lord of Israel than all of the kings of Israel who were before him. Ahab marries Jezebel, who was a worshiper of Baal, creates a temple. Remember last week, Solomon created a temple to Yahweh, the one true God. Here we have another king of Israel, but he is creating a temple to Baal. And that's where we kind of pick up this story. This is not a good king. And we pick up the story in chapter 17, and so we will, like I said, we will read the entire chapter before, it's not that long, but we'll read the entire chapter before the morning is over. So we're actually going to look at verse 1. We're going to hang out here for a while, just so y'all know. So it says, Now Elijah the Tishbite from the Gilead settlers said to Ahab, As the Lord of Israel lives, in whose presence I stand, there will be no dew or rain during these years except by my command. So this is one of those verses you kind of just look at and you're like, oh, okay, that's That's interesting, but there's this incredible amount going on in this verse that sets up where we're going. As I said, Ahab is a worshiper of Baal. Baal, in the false gods, in the Canaanite world, Baal is the god that controls, guess what? The rain. So if it's not raining, it's because Baal isn't letting it rain. Now, Baal doesn't want to withhold rain, but there's a problem. Okay, I'm about to tell y'all this is ancient history, and it's what they believed. None of it is what we believe. So don't think like, why does the pastor talk about that? I'm going somewhere with it, okay? But so Baal was subordinate to another god. The god that he was subordinate to was the god Mot. Mot was the god of death. So if it wasn't raining, there was one big reason for it not to rain. Because periodically, Baal had to go and give himself to Mot. Now, I was reading this week, and I don't really know what give himself means, or to be subordinate, but I think it meant that if he was the god of death, that he killed Baal. Because the book I was reading also said that just, so he would kill Baal, and then within a few weeks, or however long it might last, Baal would be revived, Baal would come back, and then Baal would allow it to rain. That's what they believed. Now, why is that important to this verse? Because Ahab is the king, and the king worships Baal and set up the temple to Baal. Baal was the god that made it rain. So if Baal wasn't showing up to make it rain, whose fault was it? Ahab's. So Elijah goes to the king and says, I want you to know something. My God, the Lord God of Israel, he is alive. And this made-up God that you're worshiping, he doesn't control the rain. My God controls the rain. And it's not that it's not even going to rain, there's not even going to be dew until I say so. Now, this statement sets up what we're doing in this chapter. But part of what I want you to see, because by the time we get to the end, this is more than this, oh, there's a famine, there's Ahab. This is a clash between the false god Baal, his supporter Ahab, and the royal throne, and this little weird guy named Elijah, who worships the God, the Creator, the one true God. And this story isn't just about famine. This story is about a clash of God between Ahab and between Baal. Now, if y'all know the story, we're just a few stories away from the altar and the rain and all of that story. The story's going there, but we're not going to get there today. All right? So that's what's going on. All right, so let's read a little bit farther. Verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to him. So that's Elijah. The word of the Lord came to him. Leave here, turn eastward, go and hide at the Wadi Cherith, where it enters the Jordan. Now, what is a wadi? A wadi, if you can look it up, it's just a little ravine. It could be anything from, just from like a little valley where a creek enters into a river. It could be a big puddle, kind of anything in between. I think probably the best way to say it is it's a low spot in a creek, okay? So water has collected there. So God says to him, go to the wadi. You are to drink from the wadi. I have commanded the ravens to provide for you there. So he proceeded to do what the Lord commanded. Elijah left and lived at the Wadi Cherith, where it enters the Jordan. The ravens kept bringing him bread and meat in the morning and in the evening, and he would drink from the wadi. After a while, the wadi had dried up because there had been no rain in the land. So don't miss the scene. God says, hey, Elijah, that's what I want you to do. I want you to go out in the middle of nowhere, and I'll provide for you there. Leave the city, Leave where you are, go out into the middle of nowhere, go out into scarcity, and there I will provide for you. Okay, y'all see what's going on? So he goes there, and what happens? Exactly what God says will happen. He has water to drink from, the ravens come, bring him bread, bring him meat. It sounds delicious. And comes to him, and he eats there with them. Okay, everybody with me? So, the water dries up. So verse, where are we? Oh, sorry. Thank you, Heather. So this is kind of a point that I want us to kind of make because it's going to go through the sermon. I'm getting ahead of myself. The piece of the story that I want you to hear at this point, God provides even when it comes from an unlikely source. I see some heads nodding because you have the same story. God is providing here. Okay, so let's go into the next story. So the very next story, it says that the word of the Lord came to him. Get up, go to Zarephath, that belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Look, I have commanded a woman who is a widow to provide for you there. Now, just, again, the setting is so important. Elijah. You've been over here at this wadi. You've been drinking the water. The ravens have provided from you. You are away from your home. You're in a distant land. This is what I want you to do. I want you to go over here to this no-name place called Zarephath. And go to the no-name place. And then in that no-name place, I want you to go to a no-name place called Sidon. And then when you go there, I want you to find a woman who is a widow who has no name either, or we're not told in the story. So go from a nameless place to a smaller nameless place to a nameless woman and stay there. Why? Because I will provide for you. So once again, what do we know? God provides even when it comes from an unlikely source. Go away from where you are comfortable to a wadi, eat from the ravens, go farther away from where you're comfortable to a no-name place in a no-name city and a no-name widow. And there I'll provide. Okay, y'all with me? That's where we are in the story. So Elijah, what does he do? He does exactly what God tells him to do. He got up and he went to Zarephath. When he arrived at the city gate, there was a widow gathering wood. Elijah called to her and said, please bring me a little water in a cup and let me drink. Verse 11. She went to get it, and he called to her and said, actually, could you also bring me some bread? Please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. Verse 12, but she said, as the Lord God lives, I don't have anything baked. Only a handful of flour in the jar and a bit of oil in the jug. Just now I am gathering a couple of sticks in order to go and prepare it for myself and my son, so that we can have one last meal before we die. What have we been saying? God provides even from an unlikely source. And so, what does Elijah say? Elijah says, guess what? Elijah says to her these little words, and if you remember, we were back in Abraham, Genesis chapter 15, I told you about these words. I said, anytime an angel shows up, if a celestial being shows up in your life and says to you, do not be afraid, what they are saying is, that means I'm about to tell you something good. This is good news. Okay, y'all remember that? Abraham, this is good news. Mary, this is good news. The angels that show up to the shepherds on that Christmas night, what were they saying? Do not fear, for I bring you good news. Elijah is not a celestial being, but Elijah is still bringing good news. And Elijah says to her, do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But before you do that, before you go and make something out of the little bit you have, I'm going to need you to make a loaf for me. Make a small loaf and bring it out to me. Make nothing out of something, or make something out of nothing, and bring it to me afterwards. After you've used it all up, then you can make something for your son and yourself. So verse 15, so she proceeded, sorry, did I skip ahead? For this is what the Lord of God says, the flour jar will not become empty and the oil jug will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the surface of the land. Verse 15, so she proceeded to do according to the word of Elijah. Then the woman, Elijah, and her household ate for many days. Ate for many days. So just kind of process the whole story. Elijah, where did we start this story? Where was Elijah? Who was he with? Ahab. Okay, we can assume if you're with the king, you're in a pretty good place, right? Materially speaking. He's with the king. God says, leave the king and go where? To a big puddle in the middle of the desert. I will provide for you. And God does what? He provides. And then God says, now I want you to go to a nameless city, a nameless place, to a nameless woman, middle of nowhere. And what am I going to do? I'm not just going to provide. I'm going to continue to provide. I'm going to continue to do something in your life and in their lives. And God is one who provides from unlikely places. And so they eat of that bread. We've gone down. Let's go verse 16. Let's go to verse 17. So that story, if you see kind of a chapter or a little bit of a break there, we go into verse 17. After this, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. His illness got worse until he stopped breathing. Now, just, again, I know I keep stopping. You are thinking, are we ever going to finish this chapter? At some point, God will provide. So, thanks y'all for laughing. That was a good one. All right, so what's happening here? This woman, let's kind of think through what she has. She's a widow, so she doesn't have a husband. She has no way to make money because women do not work outside the house. There's famine, so she has no water. She is down to her little last bit of flour and a little last bit of oil. Elijah meets her and Elijah says, make me something. And she's like, well, what I have, I was holding it for my son and I to have our last meal before we died. She has no hope. And Elijah says to her, and this is my paraphrase, but Elijah says to her, there is a God who provides. Do what he has commanded and he will continue to provide. And God provides. But this woman who doesn't have a husband, who has very little food, she does have one thing going for her, doesn't she? She has a son. In our world, we would call it Social Security. She has someone that's going to take care of her. She has someone that when he grows older, we don't know how old he is, but when he grows older, he can get a job, he can take care of his family, he can take care of his mother, right? That's the way it works. She has one thing going for her. And we get to the next story, and he gets sick. She, out of her just complete brokenness, complete desperation. There's some anger in this, and I think the anger's okay. She says to Elijah, man of God, man of God, what do you have against me? Have you come to call attention to my iniquity so that my son is put to death? Elijah, I know I have nothing. You didn't have to come here and point it out to me. But the one thing I have going for me, I'm about to lose. So Elijah says these incredible words to her, give me your son. Now, this isn't that different than what Elijah said just a few verses ago when Elijah said to her, when she said, I'm going to go make bread. My son and I, we're just going to go die. And he said, well, actually, I need you to make me a small loaf first. And now he says to her, the things that you do have, give them to me. Give me that loaf and God will provide. Give me your son. So he took him from her arms, brought him up to the upstairs room where he was staying, and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, Lord, my God, have you also brought tragedy upon this widow I am staying with by killing her son? Then he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times. He called out to the Lord and said, Lord, my God, please let this boy's life come into him again. So the Lord listened to Elijah, and the boy's life came into him again, and he lived. Verse 23, then Elijah took the boy, brought him down from the upstairs room into the house, and gave him to his mother. Elijah said, look, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, now I know you are a man of God, and the Lord's word from your mouth is true. So we have these stories. We start these stories, and we kind of can walk through them. We have Elijah being fed by ravens. We have the widow's flour and oil. We have the widow's son. And it kind of leaves us at a point where we have to ask the question, like, what do we do with this? What do we do with these stories? Where do we go with these stories? As most of you know, if you're around me very long, and if we're preaching in the Old Testament, there is a name that I use probably more than any other name. I quoted him just a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to quote him again, but a man by the name of Walter Brueggemann. I would argue he is the greatest living Old Testament scholar. And I ran across a sermon this week. The sermon was preached at a little Presbyterian church in Pennsylvania. But the sermon was preached on November the 12th, 2000. Now, some of you who were alive in 2000, I was newly married in seminary. But November the 12th was the Sunday after the 2000 election. Some of you might remember the election. There was a man named George Bush and a man named Al Gore. And on November the 12th, we did not have a result to an election. It took weeks. The country didn't really know what to do, and we were kind of asking some of those questions. And on that Sunday, Walter Brueggemann was in Pennsylvania. He taught in Georgia, but he was in Pennsylvania. He stood before a church and preached a passage. 1 Kings chapter 17. Preached a message on the scarcity of empire and the abundance of a God. And I think sometimes when I look at some of these things and read this, in this week as I've been reading this passage, it is not a passage that I picked for the Sunday before an election. These passages are chosen years in advance. But here we stand. Here we stand as a church, some of us worried, some of us not knowing what Tuesday will hold or what will hold the days after Tuesday. And this week I have been struck by the words of Walter Brueggemann 24 years ago that he spoke before that little church in Pennsylvania, where he said these words, "The miracle is that there's more than enough. There is an overflow of abundance that defies royal scarcity. More than enough. Guaranteed by God." The Christian gospel is a summons to leave the fearful world of scarcity and to practice the world of abundance in quite concrete ways. Elijah did not just happen on this desperate woman. He was sent there. He was sent there by God. It was his vocation to go and be with her. Now, there's a lot in that quote that I could talk about, but I think the piece of it that stood out to me, and I think probably for most of you that stood out to you, is that middle piece. The Christian gospel is a summons to leave the fearful world of scarcity and to practice the world of abundance in quite concrete ways. The Christian gospel is a gospel of Elijah that is sent to places that he would have never chose. A big puddle and some birds, a nameless widow. And in the midst of those places, he found a God that provided. In the midst of the throne room of Ahab, he says to the king, I just want to tell you, you're following a world of scarcity. You're following a God that doesn't exist. And you need to know that that God that doesn't exist, that world of scarcity, is not a world that I'm a part of. The world that I am a part of is a world where we understand that there is abundance from a God who loves us. A few weeks ago, I was listening to a podcast, and the podcast was on preaching politics in the church. And one of the things that, it was two Nazarenes talking, and one of the things that one of the ladies said was, she said, one of the things is you have to make sure you get your timing right, because if you get your timing wrong, it can be bad. And I thought, yeah, that's very true. And the timing of this passage, to me, I can't help but look at. For us to be reminded as the people of God that we are not bound by an election, that we are not bound by a country, that we live in a world where God reigns. That we are not to be people of fear, that we are not to be people who run to Baal or run to Mott to think that's what makes it rain in this world. That's where abundance comes. We are people who run to a one true God. A God who lives in a way of abundance, and a God who calls us, as Walter Brueggemann said 24 years ago, to a world of abundance in quite concrete ways. You see, part of this story that's incredible is this woman was completely lost. This woman is completely without hope. And Elijah shows up on the scene and he said, let me connect you to your loss, your without hope. Let me connect you to a God of abundance, a God who brings you together so that in your life you can see that there is a God who hears your prayers, that there is a God who knows who you are. And Elijah connects this woman with God. And I read this story and I can't help but think that one of the biggest roles that we have in this world are to be people that connect the scarcity of the world with the abundance of God. This week, there are going to be people who are going to be afraid. Some of you might be those people who are not going to know what the next piece looks like or whatever that might be, but to rest in the assurance of 1 Kings 17 that says to us, there is a God of abundance. There is a God who hears our prayers. There is a God who takes our little bit of flour and our little bit of oil and says, I can still use that to do incredible things in this world. People of God, you are not bound by this world. You are not bound by the little bit of flour or the little bit of oil in your hands. We are bound by a God who provides, a God who sustains, a God who says, even in a big puddle, I can provide. Even with a little bit of flour, I can provide. Even in the midst of death, I can provide. It's a message of hope. It's a message of us knowing that we are a people who get to go out into the world and say, let me tell you the story of a God who provides. And this isn't just something that we make up, that as Brueggemann reminds us, that it is something that we can do in quite concrete ways. To connect people with a God in the midst of their scarcity, connect people with a God that we know and a God that we preach and a God that we talk about, a God that we love, a God that we pray to, a God that we sing to. To be reminded of the God that we serve. My hope and my prayer for us is that we leave a fearful world. That we leave a fearful world of scarcity and realize that there is a God who wants to bring us into his world of abundance, his world of provision, his world where he takes those little pieces of flour, that little bit of oil, and says, just give it to me. Let me do something with it. Don't hold it back, because that's the way the world of scarcity works. Give it to me. My hope and my prayer is that it's the people of God going into an election in 2 days, that we live as a people who say, God, here's what I have. It's not much, but do something incredible with it. And I believe the God that we serve can do incredible things with the little meager bit that we have. That is my hope this morning. That is my prayer this morning, is that we are that church. We are that people who don't walk into an election afraid, but walk into an election and say, let me tell you about my God. A God who moves, a God who acts, a God who does incredible things. A God who we are reminded week after week. A God who doesn't allow sin, lies, barrenness, evil, darkness, or death to get the last word. But a God of abundance. A God who associates with words like grace, truth, hope, goodness, light, and life. And as we're reminded in chapter 17, also resurrection. Also resurrection. This morning, John's going to come and we are going to sing a song that is a reminder to us of who we are, of what it is to live in a life of abundance, a life that even in the midst of hardship, a people who follow that God who gives us life. This morning as we sing, we're going to close as we normally do, that if you would like a pastor to pray with, Pastor James will be right down at this altar. He would love the opportunity to be able to pray with you. This morning, if you would like to be anointed for healing for any reason, physical, emotional, spiritual, maybe there's something that you're carrying this morning that you just need to say, God, you need to have this. You need to have this fear of scarcity that permeates over my life. And I need to know your healing touch is upon me. I would love the opportunity to pray with you, to be able to anoint you, and I'll be right down at this altar. But there might be some others of us that just say, Pastor, I've lived in the fear of scarcity. I've lived as this woman that says, well, you want me to give you what? Because I don't have anything to give. And I need to hear God's calling upon my life today to say, I want to use what you have. Might not seem like much, but a God who can do incredible things with the little that we have. Maybe we need to come this morning and just say, God, take this little bit of flour. Take this little bit of oil and bring it into your world of abundance. Let us stand as we sing.